Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. For once in, I believe it's about 6, 7 weeks. The show will be. You'll be watching this on a Saturday if you're watching the premiere. I'll say that much. It's good to be back on the normal time slot or semi-normal time slot since it's a good old Friday night for us here in the actual so-called studio, as the kids would call it. But while this intro is derailed enough, let's get the show right back on the rails and talk about some of the smaller stuff this week before getting into all the chaos in the Middle East this week. And it's going to be a pretty Middle Eastern heavy show. So if you're one of the original fans of the War Report, you'll remember the old shows where we spent an hour talking about the Middle East exclusively. You're almost going to get that, but we got to cover some news about Eastern Europe and the wonderful decisions of the U.S. State Department. So I'll start out with the funny one, or sad. I don't know how you want to interpret this. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has given the green light for the U.S. embassies to fly the rainbow flags. Now, of course, with the way it is, the rainbow flags will have to fly at a lower level or directly below the U.S. flag, which I think is honestly a bit deceptive at this point. You might as well put the rainbow one at top with the way things are going, especially considering the fact that, not to get off on too much tangent, I want to just briefly touch on this. You look at the symbols of foundational America, the people who actually built this country and expanded it, and were really the people who you would think of as Americans, the people who self-identify as Americans, who are mostly in the South nowadays. You got symbols like the American flag, and whether that be the current one or the historical ones. For example, the Betsy Ross flags used like back during the Revolution, the first iteration of the American flag, or the old Confederate symbology, old Confederate flags. These symbols, especially the Confederate ones, have been demonized because there's something that is left of a foundational American identity, which has fundamentally been destroyed, I would say, post 1945 at the latest, possibly earlier if you want to go into maybe the early 1910s. But it's that fundamental change when America went from a republic to Empire 1.0 to Empire 2.0, where Empire 1.0, as we've discussed, was something like the great powers of the 19th and earlier 20th century. You may think of a figure associated with that would be Teddy Roosevelt, where it's, yeah, we're being imperialistic, we're asserting our will over these other nations, but ultimately we're doing it as Americans, as an actual nation, and not an idea of vague abstractions like concepts like liberty or freedom or any of these other words that they really can't give you a definition of. It's no, we're Americans and we need the sugar. Sorry, Cuba. It's that kind of imperialism versus the other kind. Whereas we've entered Empire 2.0 after World War II, more the liberal internationalism, the globalism, so to speak, where it's we have to defend freedom and democracy, we have to make the world secure, and we have to be the global policeman. And that's been the era we're in. And you could argue with the raising of the rainbow flag, we're going to be in Empire 3.0, which is the empire of social justice and the marginalized people and fighting to liberate them. And I honestly do think we're witnessing another fundamental transformation of empire because the empire established in 1945 is finally starting to run out of steam. If you haven't noticed that, this seems like their last ditch effort. If they attach themselves to these absurd movements, such as the global gay rights movement, which was started by Donald Trump, of all people. Funny enough, it was actually him and Pompeo's decision not to fly the rainbow flags at the U.S. embassies, and they only wanted to do that for Pride Month. It looks like, to my understanding now, it may just be a Pride Month exclusive thing. It looks like Blinken has given the green light just in general for these flags to fly at the U.S. embassy, but again, I do think this is very
That,
telling to the world, and I do think, as ridiculous as it sounds, it's drawing a line in the sand. It is a you're with us or you're against us moment. It's explicitly saying if you want to be part of the American led world order, if you want to be part of the quote unquote good guys, you have to support these things. You have to support this absurd amount of liberalism. You have to support this LGBTQ CIA movement. Some exceptions apply. If you're Saudi Arabia and we need you for strategic reasons, you'll get a pass. But most of you are not going to be exempt from this. And I expect this to correlate with a direct promotion of these sort of things and these troublesome allies, so to speak, such as Poland and Hungary. Of course, we're going to do it to our adversaries, such as Russia, such as Iran, even possibly China at this point. But countries that we're definitely not on good terms with are going to face the brunt of this, whereas countries that are rebellious but still on our side technically, they're going to get a bit of it. Whereas it's pretty much saying if you want to be part of the Western Alliance, if you want to be part of the quote unquote winning team, you have to accept all these things, which, again, we'll see how that plays out. Now, I know pretty much all the governments in Europe, barring Eastern European countries, and some of those ones are too small to withstand any pressure that may be put on them. As you saw several times over, you see them cave even nowadays. There's a reason why Poland has an outright ban gay pride parades, whereas a country like Russia has or Iran has, because again, it goes down to the amount of influence, it goes down to the amount of power they have within their own society and on the world stage, respectively. But I do think it is going to still not. It's not going to sit right with a lot of Americans, despite how overwhelmingly pushed it is in the culture. You look at the opinion pollings; it does have majority support, but it's not that popular. It's a fair majority. I'd say like 60 some percent of the population, but still a significant minority holdout. Not that that's going to do anything, but in a lot of these other countries, you may think, yeah, I mean, there were countries in Europe who legalized gay marriage after us. Germany did it in like 2017, 2018. Some places only have the quote unquote civil unions, like Italy, and I think Spain recently got the gay marriage. But point being is, in terms of quote unquote gay rights, it turns out, I don't know, maybe behind somewhere like Canada, America is a leader among Western countries, which is funny when you listen to the rhetoric about it. You'd think we were one of the most backwards places about it when, I mean, aside from somewhere like, what was it, the Netherlands, some of these really hyper liberal statelets. America has been one of the most social liberal countries in the world, and there's no denying that. And of course, you can point to the small, like, oh, look at what they did, and look what the Alabama state legislature tried to do that got immediately struck down by the courts. Those are the kind of things that I always go to. But at the ultimate point I'm trying to make with all of this is it is an explicit admission that this is what our empire is about. This is what it's all about. It's no longer about the abstractions of freedom and fighting terrorism, like something Bush would have proposed, or it's no longer about American interests like they may have proposed in the early 20th century with their imperialism. No, it's outright about this chaotic, I would say, anti order, anti nature movement. It's about this extreme libertinism, and again, the only thing you can really call it is the LGBTQCIA because it sums it up so well. Especially as time goes on, that acronym becomes more and more apt. But like I said, it's just a direct admission that, yeah, this is what it's about. We don't care what you think. You're either on our side or you're not.
Right, and it's as we've discussed before, it is the theopolitical position of America, and it expects the entire world to adopt this position because it gives America a kind of unlimited soft power. America defines what the future is because you cannot talk about this ideology without a priori recognizing that it is the future, that America always represents the future. And so, in some ways, that mitigates America's sins of the past. Uh, so it's a shrewd move because, like Britain, much of its economy is financial now. It's more financial capitalism than it is manufacturing capitalism. Um, so I think that has been the case. In some ways, it has similarities during the Cold War, where America did its utmost to distinguish itself from any previous quote unquote authoritarian regimes. So that included both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Um, by the CIA's estimation, for instance, these wholesome propagandistic artworks that were developing in Soviet Russia, particularly in the 30s and 40s, uh, except for the symbolism, did not look very different than those during the 30s in Germany.
Yeah, to bring
So,
back, make 2 weeks in a row, Maxim Gorky, he was an author, but point being, he was the founder of the socialist realism sort of not only writing style but
yeah,
art style, where it's like if we're going to appeal to the people, we can't just do these abstract theories like the communists have been doing since the mid 1800s. We actually need to be a people's ideology was sort of thought of the people at the time who designed this. Where again, you look at Soviet paintings in the 30s, whether that be like of farm laborers or soldiers or anything. Again, they look like Norman Rockwell paintings, and you want to take it even a step further, it looks like Nazi Germany propaganda. But point being, I think that says more about the time than it does about any of those particular regimes where there's
Yeah.
still I wouldn't necessarily say pride in self, but self at least a self respect like on a national level, like we view ourselves as just normal, everyday, hardworking people, and again, that's how they pitch their ideologies. That's how all three of the big players of the 20th century pitch their ideologies, and I know what point you're going into about how that was pretty much subverted in the West, and that's how we got to a lot of this degenerate and depraved sort of artwork. But I'll let you go more into detail about that since I know you're much more well versed in that than I am.
Right, and you can see this tendency too in China and North Korea. So there's nothing unusual about it. Um, I think what America recognized that what it understood what the crossroads between technology and culture were, uh, even as far back as the late 40s and 50s, which were which was a time that you had artists like Franz Klein and Robert Motherwell and Pollock. All of these guys were active and painting at the time, but their artwork wasn't pushed until the 50s. And I think the reason for this, in my opinion, is that film and TV essentially took over this role. And when you look at how frequently did people in the Soviet Union or China or Mongolia or North Korea attend theater, a movie theater, that is. Um, how many of them could own a TV? So, in a way, painting, you could argue, was liberated, that it no longer was obliged to create realism or plein air paintings or the aerial perspective that had defined the West since the Renaissance, right? The vanishing horizon point, and so on. So that was over because, well, I mean, that's what a camera does. And so that kind of painting is no longer necessary. And so America spent much of its time distinguishing itself as much as possible from the Soviet Union, right? And um, so representative painting became gauche. It was something that was poo-pooed on at any art college, any university. So whether you were aiming to become a painter or I don't know, teach art history at a university or at a high school or whatever, it was understood that this was the future. This was the evolution of painting.
And the funniest
And
part of it all, Western communists bought right into it.
yeah, so but one thing that didn't change is that artwork always requires wealthy patrons. So you can talk about Velázquez or Rubens being funded by King Philip's court, or the name escapes me of the king that Rubens painted under. But the truth is, the CIA is parallel or nearly parallel with that notion, right? So it's a long-winded way for me to basically say that um, you know, queer liberation, women's liberation. This is America sort of predicting the future, being, reading the tea leaves and also determining the future themselves. Um, and that becomes the theopolitical position, and no one can argue against that position because half the world agrees to some extent with those tenets, with those ideas. Let's say it's human rights, right? Well, human rights has been further extrapolated, and democracy, of course, is a way for the let's say the disprivileged or the marginalized people or the people maybe who don't deserve to have power, they are promised power and representation. And from that, you will get enormous loyalty. So, in this sense, they understand why democracy is powerful and how it works as an incentive to desires for power and representation. So that is a long-winded answer to why they're flying these flags all the time. Now, of course, I mean there are diehards, right? They do believe it's America's mission to make sure every country legalizes gay marriage and everything that will entail. Uh, so, but it's also symbolically a way for America and the West to distinguish itself from the backward world, right? Um, so America's always looked at the world as being backward. America's always been a futurist nation. It's just now it's redefined what it means to be futurist.
Yes, and that turned into much more of a tangent than I expected. But I mean, we're gonna need to do an entire show on just like sort of like media, art, and propaganda, just like as a complete aside from this, just to put context. But there's your taste of it. But I think that more than well enough explains the rainbow flag flying at the U.S. embassies for now. Again, that's a topic I definitely want to touch on in the future, but we have a few other news I need to get through this week, so I will continue with the other one is our brave boy Navalny, right there in Russia, fighting in the power, fighting the man, Putin's arch nemesis. You know what his next act of bravery was?
Eating a meal.
How do you know? How do you know? I mean, yeah, he ended his hunger strike, which just shows how much Putin
Yeah.
was starving him, and it lasted less than a week. I mean, I'm not saying I eat much more than I should. Okay, I will admit that, but I think I could probably last longer. And number one, I would not do a hunger strike because that's just stupid. I think there's much better ways to protest such a quote unquote oppressive system, such as Fed posting on the internet doing a show like this. That's my method.
Mhm.
See, we're just like Navalny, okay? We're just as brave. In fact, we're braver than Navalny. But uh, with that out of the way, he has ended his protest, and again, I'm just wondering what his next publicity stunt will be. Will it be a self-immolation that he backs out of last minute? He'll get the, or will he send in a ringer? That's what he'll do. We'll send in somebody to self-immolate in his place. That's
Wait, how does he know the meal isn't poisoned? I thought Putin wanted to poison him.
no Putin.
Wow,
Okay,
maybe
look,
he is brave.
Putin is so diabolical. The way Navalny knows this is that he will only poison him with his underwear. Okay, there's no other way. So you see, he hasn't been wearing underwear since he set foot in that prison, and look, that's all I'm gonna. That's for me to leave it. But point being is, Putin's too diabolical just to poison his meal. That's how he knows. But or it could just be that Navalny is a fraud and that everything he does is a publicity stunt and that he's one of the worst astroturf quote unquote revolutionaries in probably all of history. I can't think of one worse than him, honestly. Perhaps.
Uh, I, I think the next step is for Putin to hire Petrov and Borisov to eventually kill Navalny. That's these are the two masterminds behind the Novichok or Salisbury attacks and the the Czech Republic explosions at the munition site back 7 years ago. Navalny has gone too far. So
Oh, of course. And as we know, they have a wonderfully successful track record with both the street balls being in the ground now. Wait a minute. They're still alive, despite such a dangerous poison being used on them. But in other
yeah,
Russian news, Biden is talking a big bad game where he wants to make sure, he wants a guarantee that Russian troops will move away from the Ukrainian border, while also diverting, as you said, the fleet that he was going to send to the Black Sea sending them back home, sending them back to port, wherever that may have been. But point being is that's Biden's big show force for the week, I suppose. And one other Biden story that involved Russia is they had a multilateral state meeting between heads of state and other political figures via teleconference, and it was a big call. It had all the screens, and it was funny because Putin was just in the middle. He looked normal. You had one of the Italian delegation seats just sitting empty. The French apparently had technical problems, so guess what color their screen turned?
Well, I didn't notice. I saw the glitch, but I didn't see the screen
The,
go.
the screen
Not the video
the,
I
the,
watched.
the screen turned into a blank white background. A nice white flag for the French. Uh, and you had Biden, the only one there, sitting there completely in mask and everything.
Yeah, literally the only one virtue signaling the mask. Like he's so tiresome.
And you had like all the chief Western neoliberal leaders on that meeting too. So it's not like they were all doing it. It was literally just him.
Yeah, I know. Uh, I knew our man Macron would not do it. He he has become more based.
Yes.
He's yeah. So I knew him and Putin were the two. I thought they're not going to wear masks. But then when I saw that it was only Biden, well, I'm sure he consulted Dr. Fauci. Everybody loves Dr. Fauci. Uh, yeah. So yeah, it looked ridiculous. A lot of virtue signaling. I mean, this is a conference where you have all these heads of state. Uh, Biden's already been vaccinated. There's nobody within 10, 15 feet of him. He's alone in this room being recorded, and he puts on the mask. Not when the camera was off, but when the camera is on. And Blinken, in another video, did the same thing. So it's all optics. It's all moralizing, right? America, you know, and its corporations have decentralized. So all it has right now our military wing, which is the Pentagon, and the next salvo is to internationalize America's theopolitics, essentially, right? And that's what this is about. Taking COVID extremely seriously. Unless you do what I do, you're not taking COVID seriously.
Yeah, even France and Germany, who just announced new measures to combat the so-called spikes, like they're not much compared to what some of these blue states are doing here in America. And I suppose Canada, just as sort of a cultural extension of America at this point, could also be compared. I know that uh, Toronto is particularly bad from what I hear from some people up there. But point being is, like even in like a lot of these other neoliberal bastions, they're not taking it quote unquote seriously as, for example, somebody like Biden is.
Yeah, although, yeah, I won't get into it. I mean, in Canada, there have been protests, particularly in Montreal and some other areas of Quebec. But not that that didn't happen in Toronto. It did, but it was very short lived, and they were very small. In Quebec, the protests were quite major this weekend, last week. So, I mean, they don't get any coverage, and that's kind of the point. There was a little bit of coverage, but it's very cursory. There's no obviously it's not an emergency, but really the real reason is they don't want to give a platform to the protest. They know that it would gain popularity, so they're obligated to show that it's happening because too many people have seen them. And at the same time, they are only obligated to do it once in order to say that it's happening, but not create a platform. And it goes with like any kind of news that you watch, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it why they would just cover it up and keep it quiet. But I suppose we can move on to our main topic of the week now that we've exhausted most of the other news. And it's been a hell of a week in the Middle East, hasn't it? And I haven't said that phrase in a while. Not that the Middle East is ever particularly calm, but I suppose we'll start out with the biggest story, which is the little skirmish between Syria and Israel. Now, this felt like something straight out of 2018, from what I can tell you. So, you had, dare I call them, routine Israeli strikes on Syria on the various positions, and an air defense system near Damascus, of course, fired in response to this and to the missiles and jets sent into Syrian airspace. Now, of course, they were the S 200s, and of course, no air defense system is perfect, so one of the missiles went astray, and this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and landed near Dimona nuclear reactor. Now, that's the nuclear reactor where Israel will neither confirm nor deny that their nuclear program is based out of, that's been based out of since the 60s. And it landed in the same town of Dimona, but like not on the reactor itself, but again within the vicinity of it. Enough for it to be too close for comfort. So, in response to this, Israel struck those air defense targets again, and they actually did some damage. This is one of the more successful Israeli strikes in quite some time, if you're to believe their satellite imagery. Now, there was a
Hmm.
similar case to this. I think it was all the way back in 2019, where there was a skirmish between Syrian air defenses and the Israeli Air Force, where a Syrian. At first, everyone thought it was part of an Israeli jet, but it turned out to be a Syrian missile landed in Cyprus, and that almost caused a stir, but it quickly de-escalated. But things have just been tense with Israel in quite some time. They've been having problems with the Palestinians that do predate this most recent skirmish with Syria, but on top, this just adds so much more fuel to the fire because you had, of course, Israeli forces shutting down a lot of, or cracking down on a lot of Islamic worship services on, of course, today being Friday, which is the day where Muslims congregate. And that, of course, led to rioting and protesting and the pushing back against that. And according to recent news, the Israeli forces are allegedly planning a strike on Gaza as we speak. So that will
Mm.
probably come at some point tonight after we're done recording, but before the show comes out. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, yeah, there's probably going to have been strikes in Gaza by the time you hear this. And it looks like the most heated Israel and Palestine have been since the opening of the new American embassy in Jerusalem. And that was a pretty short lived clash, but it looks like this one, I'm not saying it's going to spiral into anything big, but this is one of the bigger ones I can call to mind in quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of think I just want to go back to the exchange that happened between Syria and Israel. So, as you said, Israel was on a sort of routine sortie bombing Syria, which is illegal. And now they were not effective in destroying anything. The vast majority of their missiles were hit before they landed, and when where they landed was not significant. And they retaliated with S-200s, which are quite dated because you know Russia's already on the S-500. In any case, they fired one of them, and it appears it was errant. And that's the one, Domina. That's the one that landed in Israel near their nuclear facility. That was a bit of an embarrassment, but it's really for only, it's an embarrassment for people like you and I who are news junkies. The vast majority of people out there think like it's always been public knowledge that Israel has had nuclear weapons and they've never denied it all along, but we know that's not the case. So um, that was for a while that was really touch and go. A lot of people were thinking that Assad, based Assad, the lion has enough is enough. He's decided to go for a nuclear power plant to as revenge for Israel's attacks on nuclear facilities in Iran. But that wasn't the case. It looks like
Nuclear
the
facilities in Syria, you want to go back like 14 years ago.
right. And good point. Uh, but it's all to say that the Patriot missile system, and it's not the only one they have. It is multi-layered. Could not stop this missile. That's true for the little homemade missiles that Palestinians and Gaza use as well. But this is not. the same thing. This is not the size of a drone or a kind of a rocket that you would have on the 4th of July. This is substantive and quite large. So that was interesting. And of course, then Israel retaliated. Um, Again, they were held back fairly effectively, except for a Syrian soldier that was killed by the name. He was a Syrian captain in their army, Basil Issa Kadur. But that's the only casualty I know of on the Syrian side. And this event, in a way, intensified emotions in Israel with the Israeli authorities. And some of the videos I saw, they kind of went whole hog on the Palestinians. Um, but it's a land of contradictions, and I don't know how how this place finishes.
Well, I'll tell you one interesting thing I noticed on the night of the incident with Demona is I noticed this. This was in 2019. I remember explicitly where Israel had some skirmishes with Hezbollah, where Hezbollah struck their vehicle, struck one of their armored vehicles, and as a damage control, you had Israeli officials coming out there saying, "Oh, it was a drone. We did that to lure their fire so we could figure out their position." Whereas any other time Hezbollah have done an attack like that on Israel, they would have been crying and going to the UN talking about how their sovereignty was violated. And you'll notice this. When there are small, relatively insignificant attacks from groups like Hezbollah and Hamas into Israel, they will cry foul, they will make a big story out of it. But when something substantial actually happens to Israel, like what Hezbollah did in 2019, like what they did especially in 2006, or you look at this most recent incident that was, again, more or less an incident, it's not like they were going to strike the nuclear power plant. They go full damage control. They say, oh, nothing happened. It wasn't that big of a deal. Don't look at this. Everything is fine. Everything is under control. So you can tell, based on Israel's reaction, when they try to downplay it, when they act all casual and sly about it, that's how you know they really feel threatened. Because when they feel threatened otherwise, they will. When they don't feel threatened otherwise, they will act like they're threatened, and they'll, again, make an international media sensation out of it. Whereas when this sort of thing happens, they're very quiet until they issue their counterattacks. Now, of course, they did in Syria already. They did with the. They're gearing up to do with the Palestinians at this point. But point being is, it's not something that's exclusive to Israel, but they play their hand very well in
Mhm.
this when it comes to if they're going to do something, they're not out there talking about it, they're not out there bragging about it. So that's one good thing you could say about their leadership. I mean, from a jet standpoint, from a competent standpoint, because not only, I'm sure our viewers will be shocked to hear this, are we not necessarily the biggest fans of the state of Israel, but we also don't
Biggest.
view their administration, their government, as one of the most competent in the world. So, but that's one thing. That's one thing they're good at is hiding their hand with these kind of things. But again, we'll see how long these Palestinian uprising lasts. We'll see the amount of response to it. It could be they hit Gaza heavy tonight, or by last night by the time you guys watch this. But they hit Gaza heavy and everyone shuts up about it, or it could be ongoing. Maybe this is some publicity stunt by Netanyahu, as the Israeli government perpetually hangs in the thread, has not had a stable government coalition since 2017, 2018, and it could just be his show of strength against the Palestinians, against the Syrians, and by proxy against the Iranians, showing that I'm the only one who can keep our wonderful state that is somehow both a liberal democracy and an ethno state of our people at the same time. I'm the only one who can keep it safe. So you have to trust in me. You got to elect the Likud party, and it's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. And what really makes me think this incident is really going to go either way far one way or way far the other way is the relative silence from Washington right now. You haven't heard word from Biden, you haven't heard word from Blinken, you haven't heard word from Lloyd Austin, you haven't heard word from like even the State Department or the U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Nobody of any note, I'll say. I can't think of anyone at all you've heard word from about this. But When the U.S. is quiet, now I could be wrong. If they come out with something over the weekend, I'll give them like a Monday deadline. Then, yeah, it's probably not going to escalate further, but it means they're either really gearing up for something they really expect this to get worse, or they're writing this off as something that's really not that big a deal and will dissipate within a day.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that is how the relationship works, and I think it's going to work that way in Israel forever, essentially. Um, so there's always going to be room for a strong man in Israel, so to speak. It will always be tolerated by the U.S. and it will always be considered necessary.
Yes, and with that being said, moving into Syria proper, it's been a quiet week in northeastern Syria, at least in terms of outright clashes. Now you can see, just based on the map, how much further they've advanced towards the greater Idlib province. You're seeing some skirmishes in Aleppo where the three, arguably four factions sort of meet, where you have the quote unquote opposition, the Turkish backed forces, the Kurds, and the Syrian forces. Now, it's mainly been between, of course, the Kurds and the Turkish backed forces that have been skirmishing, but again, it's so close to that greater Aleppo area. You're seeing Turkish drone flyovers, you're seeing all that sort of stuff. But a relatively quiet week in Syria proper, aside from the events with Israel. And
Yeah.
it makes sense. I think they've really pushed as far as they could. I don't know how much the fuel shortage hit them, so I know they were having fuel supply issues just a few weeks ago, so I don't know how standard that is. That's something that can grind a assault to a complete stop. But looking at Syria right now, again, I still think something is bubbling under the surface. Still, I still think we're in for quite a big happening, probably somewhere in the summer where they completely push in, or maybe there's a massive rebel counteroffensive that pushes them out of Idlib, which I doubt, but or maybe there'll be a massive attempted rebel counteroffensive where they try to push them back. And again, this is probably the most peaceful week it's been in quite some time in eastern Syria when it comes to these quote unquote lone wolf ISIS attacks. Now, of course, you had some action in some parts of eastern Syria. In northeastern Syria, where the main zone of Turkish occupation is, you haven't seen much at all, really. And yeah, this is one of the calmest weeks in Syria, probably, I'm going to outright say it, probably since the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I mean the only sort of sad news for the Syrian Arab Army was that they lost again in that central area of Syria four intelligence assets. These are I don't even think they're assets. I honestly think they're officers. So it was another ambush. As we know, ISIS is kind of back for a year now in Syria, and they're making new grounds, of course, in Afghanistan and various parts in Africa. Um, you know, wherever they go, America is sure to follow. So, I mean, I don't know who's funding them now, but they can't do this without funding. And if America could focus on that more than some other issues, they could probably get rid of them, but I don't think they want to. Uh, but yeah, the interesting thing with Syria is also how that dovetails with Erdogan's conversation with Biden, the first one that they've had since Biden's election.
Oh, yes.
And
And
now,
I'll let you
well,
get into it. I'll let you take it.
well, I mean, Biden Biden's doing this duplicitous thing in the same way that last week he wanted to have a summit with Putin, but only after he mentioned that Putin was soulless and a killer. So only under those terms, and like literally less than 18 hours after he said he wanted a meeting with Putin and he wanted to de-escalate, he put new sanctions on Russia. And in a similar way, he's handling Turkey, although Turkey is easier handled than Russia. So he said that he is going to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. But according to the Turkish press, according to one of Erdogan's ministers, it appears that the meeting was extremely positive, even though Erdogan does not acknowledge the Armenian issue. That's the way Erdogan put it. But they will be speaking about missiles and treaties and whatnot is going on in northern Syria, including the battle between Turkey and the Kurds. How are they going to resolve this? Well, I mean, I don't think the Kurds are really that much of a priority for America. They can be made into a priority, and then they can be ignored. It just depends. It depends, like
They've served their
on
purpose, so to speak.
yeah, right. And I think America is always going to have some use for the Kurds, but the Kurds are delusional if they think like America, America's not going to die on that on the Kurdish hill, like obviously. So it's whenever it suits American geopolitical interests. They're obviously. I mean, if they can goad Zelensky and Poroshenko into retaking Crimea and Donbass, and then not, you know, to say nothing of Saakashvili in 2008, if they can goad them on and they're under the impression that America is actually going to save them or help them achieve their goals, well, I mean, they're being silly and they're being very naive. So for me, I'm interested to see what they're going. You know, are they going to maintain the status quo? Is something going to change about that? Is there going to be a fundamental difference? My gut feeling is that they're probably going to talk much more about the Montreux Agreement and Turkey's ambition to build another canal that they will have full control over. That I think is actually a bigger topic, and who knows? It might even be too late to rehash, um, the S-400 system that Turkey bought from Russia, and literally after spending billions, Turkey just for that system literally just left the F-35 program. They were one of the funders for that program, by the way. They were not just a small passive recipient. So that was a big move that Turkey did. So I imagine even something as weighty an issue as that I don't think is going to get the same amount of coverage. Basically speaking, America needs Turkey to keep tabs on Russia, both in Syria and both in the Caucasus. And all the other stuff is honestly window dressing.
Yeah, it's all completely secondary. And again, this whole Armenia, even though again it passed Congress a few months back and finally recognized by the president, it is going to be one of those things where it's probably just again going to be a secondary issue. Turkey's on just fine terms with plenty of countries that have already recognized it, including Germany, so to speak. But they're playing this up. This is just one rhetorical card among many, and really, it's not going to make a difference to the point where most of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, it's been so long that I don't know if there's a single survivor even still alive to this day, even in very old age. But
Mm-hmm.
with that out of the way, just an aside, you mentioned Biden's diplomacy. He will be taking his first foreign visit in June to go to the G7 summit in the UK, and then we'll be going to Brussels. So we'll see how that turns out for him. That'll be in about 2 months when he finally departs, because that'll be his first foreign visit, actually going to meet a foreign leader. Now, we received a Japanese delegation of the Prime Minister, but they were greeted by Kamala Harris, which, again, as we mentioned a couple weeks back, suspicious in and of itself. But with that being said, moving on to the news about Yemen, because I think Yemen's one of the bigger stories this week. It's something we haven't covered in quite some time, but
Mm-hmm.
if you look at our nice, nifty little map here, that red section, the Houthis, the pro-Iranian, predominantly Shia forces, have pushed much further south than they have in quite some time. Now, they've been giving the Saudis hell when it comes to firing missiles in their territory, firing missiles at their oil infrastructure, military infrastructure, etc. But in terms of actual gains within Yemen on the ground, it's been pretty stagnant as of late up until the past few weeks or so, where you have them pushing almost all the way to the southern coast, and you can see there on the map, almost to Abyan. And again, that was one of the areas that was the stronghold of the pro Saudi sort of ISIS Al Qaeda aligned forces. And seeing them get that far down south, because for a while there, again, it was stagnating, funnily enough, at the North Yemen, South Yemen border back when they were still two separate countries. And it looks like not only have they pushed south, but they've also pushed further east as well. And it's not looking pretty, as you were telling me before the show. You have these CNN correspondents that are freaking out about this, that are panicking and saying that look at we're abandoning our allies now, and the Houthis are committing unspeakable crimes against these innocent civilians, and that's definitely are not the Saudi crimes, but we're just gonna ignore that. And you have that, and you're having this media campaign because for a while there you had because it was Trump's war in Yemen. They were more sympathetic to getting out of Yemen. They were more sympathetic to cutting it off and saying we need to get out. We need to stop supporting Saudi Arabia, especially after the Khashoggi thing. That was when the big push was. But now that Biden's in office, they're really adamant about the Houthis. Like the Houthis are the real bad guys. They're the ones who are committing all these atrocities and starving people and just being enacting a reign of terror, if you will. But of course, Biden's decision to pull out most, if not all, direct U.S. involvement while still funding Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all these other countries that are involved in it. It does come, of course, with our negotiation with Iran and how that's going, the entire situation with the resalvaging of the Iran deal. But point being is, it looks like the talking heads in the media. Now we all know the talking heads in the media. They don't get their ideas from themselves. They always come from on high. So whoever is feeding them their talking points is right now, even on a network like CNN, which you'd think would worship the ground Biden walks on, are very panicked and are very critical of the recent developments in Yemen and the U.S. inaction in Yemen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, CNN even sent their Nick Robertson. He's the guy with the British. There's a lady, I forget her name, with who's also British. Um, More of a posh accent. But so Nick Robertson was on the ground. He was even driven uh, by their military chief of the Yemeni forces to the front line near Marib, and uh, it was an interesting bit of propaganda because America has avoided talking or showing almost anything about Yemen at all for 7 years since the war began. And there's some activist circles on Twitter that point out that Britain and America keep arming Yemen, and Saudi Arabia is prolonging the war, yada yada yada. But what seems to be developing, just before I expand on Nick Robertson's visit to Yemen, is that many of the things that we were assured last year, particularly by uh, some of the people on the right that thought it was better to have Biden because the lunacy would stop, that everything was being driven by Trump's presence in the White House. Not really an insane assessment, but I think the surprise is that it's almost as if Trump hasn't left the White House. In other words, Biden will have to contend with the same forces that Trump did.
Wait,
So
are you playing into the Q theory that Biden is actually Trump in disguise?
Trump is coming. You still think Trump isn't in charge? Oh my God! It never ends with the Q people. I've never seen a more tenacious believer than a Q person. I won't call them the tard thing, but okay. So whether it's BLM or Antifa, like that hasn't stopped, and Antifa is still riding every night in Portland. Like, I mean, they're going to hit their 1 year mark. I think June uh, of this year. They're literally just, I don't know, like 35, 38 days, 40 days away from that. That's incredible. Uh, it doesn't seem like there's anything that can be done. So, the war racket, of course, is pushing Biden on this. And we talked about that the last show, where I said I'm going to have to eat my hat or my words, because it looked like with Britain announcing that they're leaving Afghanistan, that was probably the case that excuse me, that they are. Uh, but we remembered that Blinken was grilled on this with what's his name, Nick Todd or Rick Todd, like I can't remember his first name. He's on MSNBC, and very similar kinds of questions were posed to Blinken that we saw posed to Pompeo. Uh, Almost indistinguishable. And now you see this with Yemen as well. So Nick Robertson is taken directly to a hospital, and there's little children. Like they're in agony. They've been wounded by bomb shellings. Um, it's gut wrenching, and it's emotionally driven. It's there to get you to support the Yemeni side and the Houthis bad, or generally, or more bad. And they go to the front line, and it's so dangerous. The chief says to Nick Robertson, we're going to have to leave. We don't think it's safe anymore. The gunfire is increasing. So, I mean, I didn't hear it, but whatever. This is a 3-minute clip. So they drive back. Now that's interesting, right? Like that's kind of counterproductive. Like, and you get the feeling that Biden really isn't in charge of this. Maybe he's in more agreement, but he's not any more in charge than Trump. Perhaps, perhaps. I don't say that definitively. I just wanted to point out how the media seems to be on a different page, that they have a different agenda, that they kind of represent what the Pentagon is thinking better than what they represent what the Biden administration is thinking. So that was an interesting piece, because of course it did a few of those right after Biden announced that he's leaving Afghanistan. I mean, within 12 hours they were all ready. They had the experts, the video footage, and so on and so on.
Well, I think we're seeing the wear and tear of the empire because under Trump, of course, especially with the media establishment, with the establishment at large, there was always a feeling of tension, if not outright conflict between them. And I think these people had a lot of jubilation, whether it be the media establishment, the military establishment, whatever, when Biden came in thinking things are finally going to get back on track. It's going to be just like before Trump came into office. It's going to be like 2015 all over again. We're going to be exerting our power. We're going to be righting the wrongs that were made under Trump and even under Obama. But then I think they very quickly realized once they got their guy in there, the constraints and power and how much power really the American empire lost in just those 4 years and how much prestige and influence they lost in just those 4 years. Whereas if Trump wanted to in 2017 or even 2018 when he did the two Syria strikes, fully commit to regime change in Syria, it would have been an uphill battle, but at that point it still would have been possible with the dynamics of Syria. Whereas when Biden struck Syria, it was a one and done thing that you heard nothing else about. The idea of regime change was completely out of the question. The idea that they could even pull it off at this point was completely out of question. Him
Right.
re entering or trying to re enter negotiations with Iran and trying to mend the JCPOA. That also is concession that America cannot confront Iran head on and we cannot assert our will in a hard power sort of sense. We can't sanction them into oblivion. We can't use our military power to get them to bend their will. We already tried the sanctions regime under Trump. That failed. So we're forced to come back to the bargaining table. And I think despite the fact where the Pentagon may infinitely prefer Biden to Trump, they realize his shortcomings and they realize that I don't know if they quite realize the realistic constraints of power, the idea that they're not what they used to be, because a lot of these people are old timers who got appointed there in the 80s and 90s who still have probably just been detached from the situation on the ground so long, think that we could wage another 91 Gulf War campaign with no problem and minimal, if zero, American casualties, and that we can just exert our will over even countries like Russia and China. Again, I think the Pentagon is a bit out of touch. I think they have a bit more optimism, or if you want to even call it that, than the average American population. I think they, or even a lot of the American establishment, I think they think this empire is up to snuff and can do what it is, which is funny while they're pushing a lot of this sort of stuff within just the rank and file of the military, like a lot of this race theory and gender ideology stuff. Of course, you've seen that spurned on by the White House, or hell, maybe that's a source of tension between the two, where, yeah, a lot of these generals probably agree with the liberal regime altogether, but they want a competent fighting force to actually enforce that regime. They think, look, you can push this stuff all over the world, but let the professional warfighters do their job, so to speak. And for all we know, that could be a point of tension. I do think with a lot of what's going on in the Pentagon, they're at least passively in support of it, including the news report that Biden will also be appointing new transgender and lesbian officials to the Pentagon.
Wow. I mean, I think maybe to flesh this out a little bit. I mean, we've known for quite some time that uh, amongst conservatives, Trump supporters, um, their support of the military is not in the same way that they supported the military during the Iraq War. It's very different now. They would prefer that the wars end. They would prefer that, quote unquote, their boys come back. They recognize that the wars were futile and that life in America, particularly for a white American, is much, much worse than it was back when the Iraq War was raging. And so they don't see how all of this, as you say, the LGBTQ CIA stuff in the military is going to help the military. But I would also say on a deeper subconscious level, for I think a lot of people who strongly identify with being Western and for being American, maybe in particular, um, the military, in a way, is like the last place where you can feel that you have a certain amount of success, that there's strength there, that there's unequivocal dominance worldwide, that
A
it,
theoretical meritocracy that you get judged based on what you can do rather than the connections you have or whatever immutable
point.
characteristics you have.
Right, excellent point. Right, that martial tradition um, that dates back over 3,000 years ago, coming out of Eurasia and going all over the world, is still going strong. Right. I mean, I have a friend of mine. It's everyone knows I'm Canadian, and he's also Canadian. Uh, but for him, this is particularly, that he does like America on that level. And I think for a lot of people who feel that America and the West can be saved, they still hold on to. And of course, as I said, the majority don't anymore. I don't think so. That is, conservatives do not support the overthrow of Assad or remaining in Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't.
Yeah, like a lot of
However,
their
we're going.
hawkishness, like from I would say 2003 to 2015, has dissipated. Like again, you had these people saying go in there and kick Syrian ass and let's get rid of Gaddafi and let's stand up to Russia. I'm not necessarily saying they've had a change of heart and have sympathetic views towards these people, but I'm starting to think like, oh, who cares about them? Why we got problems over here? Like I saw, just as a microcosm of this, an interesting post on Twitter how the Chinese state has started cracking down on feminist movements, and you had like
Yeah,
tons of like just your typical like MAGA conservative accounts saying like, "Wow, the Chinese are doing something right for once." So it's like that kind of like sentiment, that kind of attitude is becoming more and more common, even among like your average conservative right wing Americans, from what I've noticed at least.
yeah, yeah. So for many of them, this is sort of the only pocket of their civilization where they can still take a certain amount of pride, right? Um, and of course, these agendas, the queer theory and gender agendas and feminism inside the military, of course, is to get them out of the military. It's to take that space away from them. That's the point, right? And but I would say for many, like my dear friend, it is that one area where they think they can still have a certain amount of pride, but it's really just historical now at this point. We know that one of the British arms manufacturers uh, was a was a donator for the Pride Parade in London. Raytheon also supports various Pride parades, so they're out of it. I mean, these companies, their employees overwhelmingly donate to the Democratic Party. They don't donate to Republicans. So it's another case of conservatives not really being aware of how much things have changed.
Yes, and like I said, I think especially with Biden in office, especially like as the stuff becomes more and more obvious, they're realizing that what they thought they had they is completely gone. And in particular in the case of the military, where you have a lot of these rank and file people, they come from places in the deep south. They come from again that foundational American heartland. Yeah, they may be it, but you know who's giving them orders? The people who are reading the critical race theory books and agreeing with this transgenderism stuff. And I mean, you just take a look at any of these Pentagon officials who appear on cable news, and funny enough, I reference him a lot, but Douglas McGregor, who is, again, retired Army officer, main claim to fame is he was a tank commander in the first Gulf War. Large tank battle since the end of World War II. I think it was 73 using. But point being is, aside from his just raw analytical criticism of American foreign policy and American military policy from like who does this benefit, how does this benefit us, how can like what are we gaining from this? He's also very critical of a lot of the stuff, like a lot of the I guess say social engineering going on in the military. Now of course, being a military organization, training your average everyday person to become somebody who is going to kill someone for a living, that takes quite a bit of social engineering. But again, the sort of social engineering we're talking about with the, um, again, the LGBTQ CIA stuff, the race stuff, all that kind of stuff. He hasn't gone much into it, but what he says about it, I find is particularly good. If you can find the clips about that, ever since he applied for ambassador to Germany under Trump, a lot of his content has been very hard to find. So, if you can find it, it's definitely worth a watch, definitely worth a read, whatever. But again, I think you make a good point about like American disinterest, apathy towards these sort of things, especially as the foundational Americans see again that this country's no longer theirs. It hasn't been theirs in quite some time. I think a lot of people are starting to look back and realizing maybe the great golden era we had was a farce. Maybe despite the aesthetics of the 1950s or the 1980s about America being on top of the world and life being relatively comfortable, maybe it was too late even then. I don't think all of them have gotten to that point. Now, of course, we've been at that point for a while, especially myself. But I think more and more are getting to that point, and more will get to that point. But I do think, of course, all of this, the apathy among Americans, and that's even creeping into some of the elite, is a good explanation for a lot of this stuff in the Middle East. And, like, not only the disengagement, the disinterest, the point where we can actually see getting out of Afghanistan as a possibility and see getting out of Yemen as a possibility, but you can look at it and see that this is the impetus for definitely more chaos, but for the forging of a new order in the Middle East. And you've seen articles as far back as 2015. I think these things really start coming out about 2018, calling Putin the kingmaker of the Middle East when he was trying to broker this deal between Iran and Israel that held for some time, and him going to Saudi Arabia and meeting with Mohammed bin Salman at the G20. But again, I think that people are starting to wake up to the massive changes that are really underway to the point where America, theoretically, and you look at the resources of it, had a proper administration, proper leadership, not just president, but like completely like gutting of bureaucracy and restaffing of it. Theoretically, it still could be the hegemonic power it has been since, I would say, the end of World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War. But looking at the will of the American population, looking at where they really stand as a people, as a culture, as a civilization, and looking at its leadership, I think most people realize that America has long ago, maybe you can't pinpoint an exact point, has suffered a spiritual death, which now the tangible reality, the material reality of the situation is starting to catch up with that spiritual death.
Right. And I mean, that's in a way why organizations like BLM are floated. That's why they're so well supported. Everything from certain justices, certain politicians, but particularly by corporations. And then there's also tacit support that is even in the, Capitol Hill and the Pentagon and et cetera, right? I do think it'll be interesting now that Biden has said it that he is not going to support Yemen. How serious is he about that? Because in this in this clip with Nick Robertson, they focused on um, on Marib and how crucial that was. He did come out and say that 2 3 years ago it looked like Yemen and the Saudis were going to push forward well past Marib, and now this very oil centric and valuable piece of real estate, which has been a kind of base of command on the front lines, is in danger of being taken. They're only about 10 miles away from the center, so he. So it's going to be interesting to see what is Biden going to do about that. Suppose Marib falls by end of summer. Is he still not going to support Yemen? What's the GOP going to do? GOP is probably going to push really hard for him to do something about that, to come up with a peace agreement. And no doubt, him saying that he doesn't support Yemen anymore is a step towards coming up with a quote unquote peace agreement. But that can't possibly happen because, of course, if the Houthis have a decent peace agreement, and they control their ports, and that very important place of shoreline at the mouth of the Red Sea. Uh, that's not going to make Israel happy. That's going to make Iran happy, and so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. At the moment, I think he's trying to get a consensus, particularly amongst left of center, moderate left of center, extreme left of center. He's trying to get their support um, for the military in general, period. And as I've said before, it'll probably be more for domestic use. But let's say anything can happen. Ukraine is still a hotbed right now. In the absolute worst scenario, some kind of a covert war against Russia is literally the only place where Biden is going to find some amount of popular support, and it will come from the left. It will come from the GOP as well, of course, but it will be primarily people who vote Democrat if we're talking about the public sphere instead of the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, you already had just as something on it mild as when Putin invited Biden for the virtual talk. You had a lot of conservatives making jokes that, well, I can't wait for Putin to own Biden with facts and logic, like things that you would have never, like even as much as they hate Obama, they would have never even said that about Obama, like back in 2012, 2013, because they still had a sense of, again, this being their country, whereas as far as they're concerned, it's their nation, it may be their people, their land, but as far as the governance of it and the stuff that actually matters when it comes to day-to-day life beyond, I'm not saying your culture, your ties to your land don't matter, but again, when it comes to the regime in power, it's completely unrecognizable to them, and I think it ultimately comes down to that. And you make a good point. You could get everyone from like the far left Antifa sort of anarchist types to the pussy hat wearing blue wave little uh, emoji thing in their Twitter bio. Uh, Again, all the Democratic wine moms, if you will. You can get
Yeah.
them all on board with any conflict or agitation or aggression towards Russia because, again, it represents, and I think this sort of ties back into what we were talking about last week. it represents a civilizational threat in so much of a different way China does, because China is just an alien civilization. It's foreign, something that could theoretically overtake us, whether it be economically or militarily. But again, too much of a cultural bridge to overtake us in that sense without like outright assimilation, forcing people to learn Chinese, forcing them to
It's not
assimilate
even.
Chinese culture. But whereas with Russia, especially in the case of Europeans, even in the case of white Americans to a degree, there is enough cultural crossover from the shared histories of just Europeans
Yeah,
and their diaspora in the New World to the point where you can find some sympathies. Maybe not like a lot, but you can find enough.
right, right. They're not as alien, not nearly as so, right? That's why it's far easier for China to have spies working successfully in America, or spies working successfully in the Soviet Union, and Russian spies working successfully in the West, right? Because we're talking about race here. Uh, America has a big Chinese and Asian population, so you know it's not that hard for China to. I mean, China's even boasted about it. I remember back in February 2018, it claimed it had liquidated something like 26 CIA assets. Like, it's pretty bold.
Yeah, and I remember they did something also
I mean,
similar in 2018. If that's not the case you're referencing.
yeah, I mean, it's a bold statement, even supposing it's not true, right? Like, America never came and said it's not true. They never contested that. They just literally said nothing. Um, so yeah, um, yeah, I would agree. There's enough shared history, and you know, uh, they simply cannot have Russia with more power in a European future.
Yeah, in any sense really, whether that be soft power, hard military power, economic power, cultural power, whatever you want to say, it's the point where, again, when it comes from a cultural civilizational point to the new America, I'll say, to distinguish it from sort of the foundational people that we've been talking about all episode, I would say Russia and by extension, European quote unquote populists are probably the biggest threat to that because they represent, again, a civilization that is removed, but not so far removed that it's completely alien, but again, still close enough where it's different, it's an existential threat, but also can be convincing enough to some segments of the population across the Western world that it may be a preferable alternative and we may mesh well with these people. Like I said, we're talking about events that are going to take a couple centuries in the most generous terms, events that we may see the precursors towards the end of my life, and I'm in my early 20s to put it in perspective. I mean, no offense, but I don't think you'll be around to see them, and I don't know the average age or audience. I haven't checked the channel demographics in a while, but judging based on what I know, again, it's going to be towards like when people from my generation are in their 70s and 80s, and so this is like long term speculation that I suppose we'll have to, that we'll have no way of finding out, at least in an earthly sense, how it plays out. But again, I do think, as short sighted as these people are, as rarely as they look into the future, I do think maybe it's just on an instinctual level, they sense a civilizational threat that must be crushed. Whereas with China, they sense a threat, but they don't feel the immediacy or the urgency about that threat as they do about Russia.
Hmm. Yeah,
But unless you have anything else, I think that's a wrap.
yeah. I think we covered basically we covered basically everything. The only thing maybe I want to reiterate is that uh, Joe Scarborough and others, were saying, "Wow, Biden is so base. He really stood up to Putin." Like, they completely forgot that, you know, a week ago he turned his ships around, right? And uh, Russia has like an ongoing uh, rapid deployment exercise every year around this time, particularly around Ukraine, for several years now. at least since 2015. And although the troops are being removed, the hardware is going to stay. You know, so just saying, if anything should happen again, and who knows, Zelensky might try to do something because his popularity right now is between 25 to 30% in Ukraine. He's very unpopular. People are very desperate. He cannot pull a rabbit out of a hat, I don't think. And let's not forget that March 30th, or it might have been in the first few days of April, we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks ago, he did say that his presidential directive was to retrieve Donbass and Crimea, right? Like, that's also why there was such a massive buildup by the Russians on the borders. I mean, he was basically saying, we're going to take these areas back, and that's that, right? America egged them on. Uh, some of the European players were silent or weren't so gung ho about it, but they were supportive. And once the Russians uh, played tit for tat, and yeah, so um, I'm imagining that if he should try to do anything, the Russians will amass all over again, and some kind of a deal was made. I don't fully know what it was. Maybe we'll figure it out in a month or two's time.
I think that's a pretty good bow on top of this nice little package. And at this rate, we're gonna just have to change the show to the Civilization Report, aren't we? Like I'm just saying. I know there's a few other things called the War Report out there now. I know if you Google it, I don't know, or put in YouTube more likely. I don't know what the first result's going to be. But point being is, I don't know if we ever get in any dispute with that. I do like the ring of the Civilization Report. So I'm not saying a rebranding is coming, but
Yeah.
if I do, if you all of a sudden see Constantine Martelli, which is a rebranding of itself, putting out a show called the Civilization Report, let it be known that it's Constantine's commentary with the War Report. And with that, my dear, dear audience, I will leave you until next time. So we shall reconvene then. Hopefully, it'll be another Saturday episode again. I really like this time slot. But until then, goodbye.
Take care.